let's just stick with El Salvador, right? You document, the massacre in 1932, then the civil war that you're talking about, and the role of the FMLN, obviously, as the rebels and resistance to that, to now, right? Which the FMLN was in power up until Bukele, or he was kicked out of the FMLN. And now you have, there is gang violence. We don't have to go into the entire history of how the U.S. has helped, foment that narco gang violence. But it is very relevant. I guess I wanted to ask you, just sticking with El Salvadoran politics, how had the FMLN changed in your lifetime? Just explain to us sort of what that reversal was like, or that change, and then maybe thoughts on currently Bukele's approach to so-called stopping the violence.
I mean, I owe the FMLN, when it was a guerrilla movement, for giving me the spiritual nourishment to understand what revolution meant, a word that seems to have been deleted from our vocabularies, political vocabulary. People don't talk about revolution anymore, and therefore are erasing, forgetting the revolutionary traditions that inform a lot of what we on the left think. At the same time, we've been given this pro-cop, pro-state narrative and pro-prison, and we have a very reactionary moment. Yeah. So the FMLN was at its peak, one of the great revolutionary movements of the Americas in the late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s, up to the negotiation of the peace accords in 92, where we won the peace. But sadly, when my former comrades got into power, they adopted the behaviors of the state, so to speak. They had you had some of the leadership. There's a difference between the leadership of the FMLN and the base. A lot of the base stayed honest and good and committed, but too many in the leadership, the most illuminated people I knew in the Frente left long ago. The people that remained were kind of the B team, politically and ideologically. And, they were corrupted easily and started, and for example, I used the gang issue to show how state power corrupted the FMLN, as did, say, for example, oil money from Venezuela, sadly.
Right.
Hugo Chavez gave El Salvador and the FMLN a lot of money to do some good, and some good was done. But some of that good went into the pockets of some of these corrupt leaders in the FMLN who didn't seem to make the revolutionary transition in the post-war period. So there's an object lesson here for us. First and foremost, we have to kind of unforget the revolutionary tradition that has been here in the United States. We're not going to liberal progressive, I think, our way out of climate change and fascism. History shows that liberalism and progressivism have not been the most effective tools to fight and defeat fascism. It's been revolutionary politics. Always has been. And so that's part of the reason I, a US born citizen, came out about my own experience in a revolutionary movement, because I wanted to stir the imagination. And I actually had to work with my publishers to put that R word in the cover of my book, right? You have...
Oh, that's selling it. You got to have the R word.
No, the R word was the least sellable in terms of search engine optimization, right? Because when the book came out, it came out during COVID. And they're like, they were like, hey, we need a subtitle. I was like, I don't want a subtitle. I just want it to be unforgetting.
Right.
And then they said, I talked to some of my consiglieres in New York, literary consiglieres, and they told me, no, you need a subtitle because people have to be able to find your book. And so you have family, migration, gangs. Those are all sexy on search engine optimization. But guess which one is not sexy?
Salvadoran gangs, let's go.
But guess which one's not sexy? Revolution.
Boo! Make revolution sexy again. That's what you're trying to say.
That's it. You got it. We have to make revolution sexy again. Otherwise, we're kind of doomed, to be frank, I believe. I don't believe we're going to liberal progressive our way out of the immense and complex and increasingly intense crises that we face. We need to stir the radical imaginary again to take more bold action like we used to do back in the day.
I agree 100%. And I say that knowing that I just said, Biden should be elected the next president. However, we need to build movements because Biden ain't it. He's not the movement at all. But I did want to ask just quickly on Bukele. You know, this is a young president who I guess wants to make cryptocurrency the national currency in El Salvador. But recently he's basically engaged in a massive mass arrests of all Salvadorans, no matter whether they have any kind of leads to gang affiliation or not. It just mass sweeps, and there's been a huge crackdown. A lot of innocent people have been locked up. And then there's some thought, you know, there was an LA Times commentary of someone writing, I support this. This is great. You know, this is what we have to do to crack down. And some civilians, some neighbors, although not the ones whose loved ones are being locked up, are like, yeah, I also support it because now the streets seem quiet. What are your thoughts on this crackdown as a way to stop the gang violence?
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons I wrote my book, is to help people understand the fascism that was clear to me that was afoot around, not just in El Salvador, but in India, in Italy, in the United States, in the form of like Trump, and then the liberal enabling of Trump fascism on issues like immigration, for example.
Yeah.
You know, because the immigration troops were the diehard troops that helped Donald Trump get to the White House. No question. They were the best organized of the fascist right, but we seem to forget that for some reason. So El Salvador is no different, is part of that kind of rise of the fascist tide. And I had a firsthand, front row seat to a country that had been home to the longest standing military dictatorship in the Americas. And so I had family related. My grandfather was part of a Guardia Civil that was a death squad, early death squad, going around killing those indigenous peoples. And then I have family that witnessed things that they never talked about. And then I myself was witness and participant in a war. And then I went and I reported on, the expression of war that is the walking, talking, and unresolved trauma of the gang member, right? And so, I wrote the book because I could see Bukele coming, and so he's very popular, and he's what I call he expresses a form of digital fascism. Like, he's surrounded by some Venezuelan advisors, some of whom were trained by the CIA, which brought, for example, Serbian online experts who were on the online politic thing way before most of us.
Right? Interesting. So what, like opposition figures, or
what's that?
Opposition figures in from Venezuela? Or,
yeah, they trained the Venezuelan right against Hugo Chavez and then Maduro in online organizing methods. I went in and investigated this, and I basically got the wrath of the CIA. And I tell you this because a source in the CIA told me they came at me because of my story in foreign policy. And so some of those people that I wrote about went on to then go to become consultants in multi-million-dollar firms, and giving advice on online politics to different politicians around the Americas and other part of the world, including Bukele. And so this is kind of we have to understand the digital space, the digital space to understand fascism in the digital age. If we come solely with an industrial mindset to the digital age fascism, we're not going to get very far. It's the mix of the two. And this is, again, why I wrote the book, to kind of like share and drop some of this knowledge I've amassed, quite frankly, from touching the tigre, en los huevos, touching the balls of the tiger. Because you don't go anywhere unless you touch the tiger where it's difficult.
Yeah, touch the tiger's balls. That's the name of this podcast. That's the name of the episode. I do think, there is something so chilling about seeing, there's these, photos, aerial photos of prisons in El Salvador with tattooed supposed gang members, kind of like, heads bowed, like sort of cramped up in these prisons. And they are sort of, these images are trotted out to be like, isn't this great? How many, like awful, violent criminals we've locked up. And I'm not saying that, look, the mothers and children and family who are fleeing El Salvador are fleeing for a reason. We've talked about, you can still say that these gangs are horrific and do terroristic crimes. But also I look at these images and I'm like, this is just a pure perpetuation of the endless cycles of violence that this country, often with this backing of the United States, has been waging on its own people for decades, And so it's like, when does this end? I mean, it's like, if you don't give folks an alternative to gangs and jail, then it's just like any other community. You know what I mean? What is the alternative? It's migration or death.
I just realized you went down to El Salvador.
I did.
Back in the day. So I was listening. I said, hey, man, Francesca's on point, man. She knows. Hey, and I did. Then I was listening. I said, yeah, she's been there. So yes. Bukele is an expression of the global fascist tide, and he uses digital technology to cover up things like what's in a recent report by a group called Cristosal, which is a human rights organization that interviewed thousands of people, relatives of people in jail, and guess what they found? The vast majority of the people that are being jailed, up to 2% of the Salvadoran population has been jailed. Overwhelmingly poor people are not gang members.
Right.
And though, even when you're talking about gang members, this is why I encourage people to read my book. They'll use the tattooed image, even today, tattooed face image of the gang members to promote these policies. When, if you know anything about the gangs, most young gangsters are not tattooing their faces anymore. Those are more than a decade old pictures that even the US media is using to exotify. And so, again, it goes back. You've got to understand these digital age practices of fascism. It's used to cover up, as you very articulately stated, that they're covering up a larger reality. That is, they're arresting poor people at will. Bukele, by the way, dismantled the Supreme Court, took them out with the military, physically introduced the military into the Congress, and has just been attacked journalism, universally condemned even by liberal human rights groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and journalist organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists. They've all condemned Bukele for the attacks on journalists, on women, on poor people, on youth, especially.
But it's that pro-cop mentality, as you were saying. It's like, it's the same here, that spans both Democrats and Republicans, liberal, conservative. It's like, at the end of the day, people don't see any alternative to just mass incarceration, sweeps, violence, really. What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.